Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Philanthropy Roundtable. My name's Fern Shepard. I'm the president of Rachel's Network. And we're going to go ahead and get started as people still are coming in because it is time. So it's been great to be here this morning and this afternoon to hear all these wonderful conservation success stories that have been incredibly inspiring messages from around the world. And we wanted to take some time now to explore the role of philanthropy in bringing about some of those conservation successes, and explore and ask some of the important questions about what the role of philanthropy has been so far. Has it been part of the innovation? Have they been part of the collaborators, the partners? Are they funding science, advocacy, public policy innovations? And then asking really the important question, looking towards the future as to what the role of philanthropy is going to be. We're hearing all these wonderful success stories, but in order for us to actually have a planet that is livable and diverse and safe for all species, including our own, these conservation success stories that we're hearing about are going to have to be brought to scale. And what is the role of philanthropy in bringing about that kind of change? Historically, as I'm sure all of you know, philanthropy has really focused in the areas of humanitarian relief, medical research, education, arts and culture. And it wasn't really until Earth Day, the first Earth Day, around 1970, when national attention started to focus on the environmental problems that were around us, both nationally and globally. We were seeing species collapses. We were seeing the effects of overpopulation, pesticides, and other pollutants in our environment. Our air and our water were polluted. And that national consciousness that brought us Earth Day also brought the charitable organizations that have historically funded in all these other sectors to begin funding in the realm of environmental protection and conservation. And since that time, it has exploded. So by 2009, protection of the environment was ranked 5th among the top conservation organizations in our country as a focus for conservation dollars. And that was just behind education and medical research and arts and culture and the humanities. As you probably also know, now we have a wide range of funding that is focused at the national level, at the global level, and even at the local level. We have funders who are focused on particular places like the Amazon, and that is where they are focusing their dollars and their attention. We have funders focused on species. For example, the African elephant. We have funders who have, instead of focusing on a place or a species, have really tried to look at ways to bring about systemic change, whether it is sustainable agriculture or alternative energy sources. We've had funders who focused on building the capacity of researchers and conservation organizations and environmental protection organizations, building their leadership, building the ability of organizations to carry out laws like the Endangered Species Act to protect species and places. We've watched major investments flow to challenges like climate change, and we've watched a smaller, committed group of funders focus on issues like environmental health and the effect of environmental contaminants. But often the strategies and approaches of funders have been opaque, and so we're really fortunate to have with us today 5 leaders from this field to talk to us about what they have seen as their conservation successes and what makes them optimistic about the future. So I'm pleased to introduce those leaders to you now. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. They will then do a presentation to tell you a little bit about their work, and then we hope to have some time at the end for questions, including questions from all of you. So beginning from my left, your right, is Winsome Mcintosh. She is the president of the Mcintosh Foundation, and she has over 40 years of experience working at the intersection of philanthropy and environmental protection. Among other achievements, she's the founder of Rachel's Network, which is a group of women funders who, named after Rachel Carson, who fund in the field of conservation and environmental protection, and Client Earth, which is an organization focused on bringing the power of the law to protect the environment in the United Kingdom and Europe. Next to Winsome is Barry Gold, who has a long history at leading large philanthropic organizations in their environmental philanthropy, first at Moore, the Moore Foundation, then at Packard, and he is now the environmental program director at the Walton Family Foundation, and he's leading their freshwater and marine initiatives. Next to Barry is Erin Rogers. She is an expert in climate and energy, and she is the program officer at the Hewlett Foundation, and she, as part of their environmental program, she manages all of their U.S. clean energy and climate strategy development and that funding portfolio. Next to Erin is Ed Warner. He's trained as a geologist, and after a successful career in the energy sector in the Rocky Mountain West, he is now devoting his energy to philanthropy. He's a conservationist, the director of the Sand County Foundation, and the author of a recently published book, Running with Rhinos: Stories from a Radical Conservationist. And finally, next to Ed is Alison Carlson. She's a Stanford University-educated biologist. She's spent more than 3 decades focusing on turning cutting-edge knowledge in biology and the environment into clear results for public good. She's the founder and chair of Forsythia Foundation, and she focuses on the intersection of health and the environment. So you can see we have a cross-section of philanthropists and their various interests. Please join me in welcoming Winsome, who will begin our panel. Thank you.
Well,
Let me just advance this really quickly.
oh, okay.
Sorry.
That's
we're
okay.
We're going
Do you know where?
backwards. Let me get you teed up. This was not the way it was supposed to be.
That's all right. We're getting there.
There we go. There you go.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I represent essentially the small family foundations, of which there are probably around 50,000 of them in the country. They're very different from the larger institutional. Okay, thank you. From the larger institutional foundations, primarily run by the families on the board. So the Mcintosh Foundation was founded in 1949, but it didn't receive a permanent endowment until 1971. That was a magic year because that's when the civil rights was in full bloom in this country, and also the environmental movement was just getting started. So we were ambitious enough to try and tackle both. We were young, and we felt that this was a learning curve for us because I was 24, my husband was 35, and we decided that we wanted to work within the system, not outside banging down doors, and that in the old days, we would settle things in the OK Corral with guns. And in our modern time, our society settles its differences with laws that we have passed to govern ourselves. So it made sense to us to try and use the law to the advantages that we could. In the civil rights area, we only were there for a brief time because we discovered we didn't have enough money to do both and be effective, and so that forced us to think in terms of focusing even more narrowly. But in the civil rights 5 years that we were working there, Charles Evers had been elected the first black mayor in the state of Mississippi, and he was the brother of slain Medgar Evers at the time. And our family had been supporting him outside of the foundation for a couple of years, and we decided that it was important that Charles succeed as a mayor of a small town in Mississippi called Fayette, and he needed the time by building up a little foundation and trying to start putting, sidewalks and sewers and all of that in until he could figure out how to get the federal funding that they, were entitled to. It was important, we felt, for him to succeed and to prove that a black man can run a government in the state of Mississippi, and he very, very ably did that. At the same time, we were also looking at this emerging network of environmental fervor that was going on, and it happened to come across the Ford Foundation negotiating with 6 young lawyers from Duke and Yale who wanted to set up an environmental law firm, a nonprofit environmental law firm. It took them about a year to convince the IRS that they were a charitable endeavor. And so Ford had to wait for that, as did we. But we decided to match Ford, which was a huge amount of money in those days for a small foundation like this. But we also felt that this was really unique, and we liked the idea of beginning to develop public interest law. So we left the civil rights after Charles's successes and moved in to partnering with Ford in founding NRDC, which is Natural Resources Defense Council. We accepted that we needed to limit our focus because we had limited resources. We believed in working within governance, and that we know and understood that we needed to take risk in order to try new things and not be afraid of that and not be afraid of failure. We continue to believe that public interest law is an important, effective strategy, and we have stayed in that field for 45 years so far. I want to give you some examples of the effectiveness that the law can have in bringing about systemic change. And that's always been our goal, is to take the smallest amount of money that we could, go out long-term, use the law to our greatest advantage, and if we won, it would affect the greatest number of people. There was a 1976 Tax Reform Act that attempted to stem tax abuses and to make lobbying efforts more equitable. But what it actually also did was severely restrict charitable giving. And it was when a lot of our foundations were beginning to move into advocacy of the environment. And that is what we had done too. So literally all of the not-for-profit environmental organizations that we were supporting were advocates and were lobbying. So this meant that we would lose our tax-exempt status if we chose to continue supporting the NRDCs and the Earth Justices of this world. We didn't think that was right. And there was no one around, sort of beating down the bushes to take on the IRS, so we decided to do it ourselves. And we appealed to the IRS and asked them for a ruling that would allow us to continue giving to NRDC, with the implication that if you didn't allow us to do that, we would take you to court, and we considered it a constitutional issue. Within a year, the IRS came back to us And in December, I think it was December 8th, 1977, we received a private ruling letter from the IRS informing us of what has since become known in tax law as the Mcintosh ruling, and it stands today. But what it did is that it then gave all the rest of our foundation community the opportunity to go ahead and fund what they were funding without fear of the IRS taking their status. Clearly, that was a decisive action that did not cost a great deal of money. We were we did it privately with attorneys, but it had a huge impact on the philanthropic sector. Now, we're all familiar with how land conservation has been developed in our country over 100+ years. We have an enormous amount of land in the form of national forests, national parks, BLM lands, and national monuments, along with our vast coastal marine estuaries and sanctuaries. We decided to focus on Alaska because it held the largest temperate rainforest in the northern hemisphere and the largest forest system out of our whole federal system. 17 million acres. We have about 58+ million acres in our forest system. That's just the forest. That's not BLM. That's not the others that I mentioned of land. But our theory was, if we can effect good forest management in the Tongass National Forest, then those practices would filter down to the rest of the forest system naturally. It, the Tongass, unfortunately, was a real political football and has been for many years. Let me see if I can give you a picture. This is what we're looking at in the Tongass. It's spectacular land, and it's meant to be available to all generations. And it was our mission, really, to try and affect change there, because we happen to love trees, truth be known. And the way we wanted to do that was through the law. And so our foundation diligently worked on bringing sound management practices. Since the 70s, our theory was always, as I said, to solve the largest system problems, and that would filter down. Where that IRS case that I just talked to you about took less than a year, the Roadless Rule Act, which was passed in 2001, which has been a political football for 14 years, was finally resolved last November at the Supreme Court level, and we won. And a little bit of an explanation on that: the roadless rule was was made a law under the Clinton administration to stop all federal building of roads in national forests. And the bill, unfortunately, Clinton made a deal with Ted Stevens of Alaska that the Tongass would be exempt from it. Not a good idea, not fair. And so naturally we funded, through Earth Justice primarily, litigation that started right after that, challenging the ability to exempt anything from an overall law like that. We won that finally in November, and I was going to walk you through what a law case like that entails, but I think you might be bored with that. So instead of doing that, what I thought I'd do is also mention a few other cases that have been seminal to the development of the environmental movement over this time. When NRDC was established, and we were able to partner with the Ford Foundation, they all of a sudden had plenty of money and some time to begin to explore how to use the law on forestry issues. And they brought a case called the Monongahela case in West Virginia. And the Monongahela forest was being literally clear-cut right down to the bone, just being savaged. And I'll show you what I think a clear-cut looks like. This is in Alaska. The trees are much bigger here than they were in West Virginia. But in any case, an intern, a good friend of mine, was working there, and he discovered a law from 1869 that said I'm sorry, that's my phone doing that. So sorry. Every tree that is cut in a national forest had to be marked and designated first. Well, what that meant was they had to axe a tree and mark it some way, and they couldn't go through and clear cut anymore. So it shut down clear cutting across the whole forest system for a full year. Naturally, Congress came in, took out the law, just got rid of it, and they were able to go back and do it. But that 1 year was very important in the scheme of things as NRDC was developing legal strategies around how to stem the tide of what was going on. And so in that year, they were able to begin to build some other cases that would be precedent-setting, that would begin to solidify the acts that have been put in place in Nixon's administration. And Nixon should get credit, and unfortunately it's overshadowed by Watergate, but he's the one under his administration in which we were all just flying because the laws that we were making at that time, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, those were all done in Nixon's time, and they were all done in a very compressed period of time, and we were all giddy because it was just amazing. And these same lawyers were not just litigating at that point, they were helping Congress to write those acts. And so the NRDCs and the Earth Justices of this world were a little bit on the inside writing those laws to begin with. I really believe in the law. I think it's important to hold the line, and if you look at what's happening today of a three-pronged stool, we have the executive branch, we have Congress, and we have the courts. It's up to us to use the courts to try to protect what we have in place and have had in place for 40 years. And that is where really the grounds are going to be for the next 4 years at least. I'm going to close with a quote by Tom Waldo, who is the lead attorney at Earth Justice on the roadless rule case. He said, "The remaining wild and undeveloped parts of the Tongass are important wildlife habitat and vital to local residents for hunting, fishing, recreation, and tourism, the driving forces of the local economy. There was no sound reason to exempt the nation's largest and wildest national forest from a common sense rule. Our lessons learned from this experience: not to be afraid to take a risk and always try new strategies, invest in leadership and build capacity through unrestricted grant making, which is all we do. We never restrict anything. Focus on a long-term objective and stay the course. 14 years is a long-term objective. Don't burden young organizations with paper demands. That's become a problem. Serve on boards and share one's business acumen, which my husband and I both had, and we have both served on a multitude of environmental boards. And lastly, be entrepreneurial. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, we should all really just give a round of acknowledgement to Nancy Knowlton. We're here because of her great idea, started a number of years ago, to really focus on success, right? It's so easy to think about all the things that are going wrong, and it's just really incredible for me to be here with all of you and see everything that we've all accomplished and to hear it all. So just a shout out to Nancy for her vision and everything that she's done. So for more than a decade, the Walton Family Foundation has invested in sustainable fisheries. And there are really three main reasons for this. First, fisheries in the oceans, they play a key role in maintaining the health of oceans. Fishing, or more accurately, overfishing, can significantly alter the overall dynamic in the oceans. They impact the health of fish populations, ocean biodiversity, ecosystem structure and function, and we're even learning now impacting the microbial environment, which is so important to maintaining the chemistry of the oceans. Second, billions of people depend on healthy fisheries for their job and their food. And third, we actually know how to fix them. And we're here to tell optimistic stories, so I thought the oceans would be a good place to start. At the Walton Family Foundation, we're optimistic about the future of the world's fisheries. It's an optimism built on hard work, tempered by realism about the challenges ahead. For those of us in this space, it's been about 20 years since the idea of sustainable seafood first took hold, and about a decade since retailers like Walmart and other large retailers committed to sourcing sustainable seafood. What was missing as the demand for sustainable seafood has grown was the question of supply. Can the world catch and or grow enough seafood in a sustainable way to meet this demand? Our view is that it can and it must. And I don't think you're going to hear from any of us up here a single silver bullet about how to do this work. It's complex, but there are success stories, and hopefully we'll get into a conversation about what they tell us about what works. And for us, we think that success comes from a systems approach. Very often the work in the environment has been very transactional, and we think that might get you a block, but it doesn't get you a long-term win. So what we've been focused on is a series of strategies or approaches. One is to empower fishermen and local communities through rights-based management approaches that provide secure tenure rights to fishermen and give them the incentive to become stewards of the resource. Making science-based decisions about annual catch limits, habitat protection, and rebuilding timelines. Harnessing the market, those retailers that I talked to you about, for creating a demand for sustainable seafood that will drive change at the country level. Building capacity for fishermen, governments, and the civil sector to engage. And finally, reforming public policies to create positive incentives that encourage sustainable fishing. So let me take you to two places to show that success is possible. The first is Raja Ampat. For the past 11 years, we've partnered with grantees CI, WWF, TNC, and many others to create a network of marine protected areas in the Bird's Head region. Now, Indonesia has a population of 283 million people, for which seafood is a primary source of protein. So this is an important issue for them, not just ecologically, but it's important for them economically and for the health of their country and their communities. It's the world's second largest fishing nation, and fishing provides nearly 9 million jobs, a significant number of which are in the small scale sector, so all the more important. And if you look at all the related jobs, we're impacting somewhere on the order of 20 million jobs with fisheries in Indonesia. In terms of economic value, in 2013, Indonesia exported nearly $5 billion in seafood. And there's recent studies that suggest if we're able to recover and rebuild those fisheries, that value could go up by $2.3 billion. So instead of having exported $5 billion, they would have exported $7.3. Not an insignificant contribution to the overall economic well-being. So for us, we focus on the economy and healthy environment going hand in hand. Lori Katz, who's in the audience with CI, took me in February to Indonesia and gave me a chance to see the work that we've been funding in person. And that's something that sometimes funders don't do enough of. We sit behind a desk and we fund things and we don't actually get out and understand whether or not it's having a real impact. This is a group of leaders from across the Bird's Head region. This is a group of leaders who came together to sign an agreement to manage the MPAs and to fish more sustainably. They're invested in the process because we identified an individual leader. We brought them, our partners, I should say. We built trust with them by identifying a leader, building capacity in the community, engaging them in designing the system, and giving them the authority and the responsibility for enforcing it and managing it, and being able to show them the benefits. So as a result of their efforts, some of the things we're now seeing is that the rate of illegal fishing is declining dramatically, down 90%. There are more fish and they're bigger. And fishermen are fishing smarter, not harder, with greater food security for their families and their countries. Clearly a success story and a sense of optimism. But it took us 11 years, right, in this one area. And it's only it's not even the whole country, which we've got to get to, and it's using one set of strategies. So now let's go from Indonesia to a place a little closer to home, the Gulf of Mexico. For decades, fishing in the Gulf and across the United States had been declining. In 2006, a bipartisan Congress reauthorized the Magnuson-Stevens Act, laying the groundwork for a new approach to fisheries management. It required that the best available science be used to set annual catch limits, and that we have rigorous rebuilding timelines, and it allowed for something that they called limited access privilege programs, which we now know as catch shares. A year later, NOAA introduced a new management system in the Gulf of Mexico for the red snapper fishery that strengthened monitoring and, importantly, gave participants the right to catch a set percentage of the allocation. So they got this tenure right that I talked about in Indonesia, just in a different way in the States. And what we saw is that the number of red snapper started to increase as we put in place these management systems. And so did each fisherman's share of the pie, right? Because they had this allocation. This gave them an incentive to think in the long term and not in the short term, and dramatically change the nature of the fishery. So as a result of those changes, fishermen pushed for a 40% reduction in annual catch limits so the stock could recover, and red snapper have rebounded. Fishermen can land nearly 3 times more snapper today than they could in 2008. Revenues are up 70%, and commercial fishing has become safer. Fresh Gulf snapper is now available year-round to Americans' consumers, and it's recognized by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch as a sustainable choice. And what we're seeing in the Gulf is happening in other parts of the U.S. as well. Since 2000, the number of fish stocks declared overfished has dropped from 92 to 38. 41 stocks have been rebuilt to healthy levels, and American jobs supported by domestic fisheries now number 1.8 million, up 15% since 2011. Now, amidst this, I would be remiss not to say that there are places where things aren't going so well. If you're from New England, you know the challenges. If you're in the South Atlantic. But overall, the picture of fisheries and the health of fisheries in the U.S. is a success story. If I had more time, I'd want to tell you about other places where we're seeing similar opportunities for success. In the Colorado River, we're working within the existing law of the river to put in place market mechanisms that are going to allow for more flexibility in how water is traded and used. And we've seen a sea change in the conversations. Recently, the governments have come to the environmental community and said, let's start to work together. The agriculturalists and the environmentalists are sitting down to find common solutions. Similarly, we're working in the Mississippi River Basin to change farming practices on 100 million acres of cropland. We know how to do that. The challenge now is how to scale it. And finally, in the coastal Gulf of Mexico, we're working to direct the settlement funds that came out of the Gulf oil spill to do large-scale restoration. And we believe that the restoration can be achieved at a scale so that we'll rebuild the salt marshes in a way that provide environmental returns, protect the city of New Orleans and the Gulf, the port of New Orleans, from which 40% of products come into the U.S., as well as enabling transportation and people to live there. So for us, the opportunity we see is in creating new partnerships among conservation organizations, business groups, and communities to restore the health of oceans and rivers. We know that the decisions we make over the next 5 to 10 years for the climate, the oceans and coasts, the air we breathe, and the water we drink will determine what kind of world we leave to our children and grandchildren. Our challenge in this room is to come together as individuals, as organizations, as governments, to learn from the stories of success that are being told here in all of the conference space, and take the actions necessary to leave a healthy environment for the future. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Rogers from Hewlett. So Winsome started off giving the origin story of the Mcintosh Foundation. I thought I'd do the same with the Hewlett Foundation. And I want to take us back to the 1930s in California, where there was a very avid Sierra Club member named Louise, who, with her friend Ansel Adams, joined the Mint Julep Club of the Sierra Club, where they would mix up some cocktails, hike out to beautiful places, and drink them together, which I think is a great idea. On one of these outings, Louise's little brother, Bill, came with them, and he met one of the fellow hikers named Flora. They bonded over their love of hiking, their conservation work, and they ended up getting married that same year. Bill and his friend Dave started a little company in their garage called the Hewlett-Packard Foundation. And 30 years later, when the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation was started, they embedded that foundation with this deep conservation ethic that they personally had and that their kids and their grandkids had. And it's in the DNA to this day of the Hewlett Foundation. So flash forward to 2017, the Hewlett Foundation has become one of the largest philanthropic institutions in the US. We give out about $400 million a year in grants to organizations around the globe. And we're very aware that all of the conservation work that the foundation has funded over the last 50 years is facing an existential threat due to climate change. In fact, almost all the work the foundation funds now, whether it be women's empowerment, global development, democracy itself, is facing grave risk, danger from climate change. And so about a third of the foundation's money now goes to advocacy organizations that are working to reduce global warming emissions, mainly from burning oil for transportation, burning coal and natural gas for electricity, and from deforestation. And I know that a lot of us can get easily overwhelmed, including myself, with fear and anxiety and even anger about what's at stake with climate change. And when we see the opposition to climate action out there, especially at this time in history. And I'm plagued with a deep sense of foreboding as to what may come if we are not able to act fast enough. We are fighting to avoid every additional increment of warming that we can, because we know that as the thermostat ticks up, the damages are exponential. But that being said, there are reasons for hope, and we can't give up. And I want to tell you about some recent successes in the United States that exemplify the transition from dirty energy to clean energy that are happening, and maybe in some places and in some ways that you haven't heard about or might not expect. So you all know that one of the United States' biggest sources of global warming emissions is burning coal and coal-fired power plants. And a lot of these coal-fired power plants are located in the Midwest and the Southeast, where the politics around clean energy are pretty tough. When I came on board at the Hewlett Foundation in 2011, I started to team up with our funder colleagues in the Midwest, McKnight, MacArthur, Gunn Foundation, and also Energy Foundation in San Francisco. And what we wanted to do was try to build some political space in the Midwest for decision makers to find a path forward on clean energy, despite a lot of opposition from the coal companies and the utilities. And we wanted to try to break this binary logjam that we felt environmental advocates had been in for so long, where it was really environmentalists versus coal companies, or jobs and prosperity versus clean air and clean water, conservatives versus progressives, us versus them. We wanted to really unlock that and just create a whole new surround sound of all different kinds of voices advocating for clean energy. So we started to fund a much wider array of groups. For instance, in Ohio, we realized that the hospitals and the manufacturers, heavy energy users, really wanted cleaner energy and more efficiency. And so we started funding the Hospital Association and the Manufacturers Association. In Michigan, we found that there were actually a lot of conservatives who believed in energy liberty, and they wanted to break away from their utility monopolies. And so we started funding the Christian Coalition and farmers and former Republican staff people and chambers of commerce leaders. In Illinois, we were supporting labor unions and consumer watchdog groups that were just made up of little old ladies who were just tenacious, and environmental justice groups. In Minnesota, clean energy businesses and consumer groups. And for the first couple years, we knew it would take a while for these groups to build up capacity and strength. So we wanted to give this time. The first couple years, they got a lot better at warding off the attacks, but they weren't able to make progress on getting new policies and strengthening policies. And started to get a little nervous. Like, okay, is this going to work? I'm telling my board that this is going to work. I'm really hoping it will. We adjusted our funding. We learned. We funded more communications, coordination support. Kept trying. Finally, in 2016, these groups started delivering some really big successes. So last year, for instance, Minnesota, their electric utility, their biggest utility, made a pledge to reduce its global warming emissions 60% by 2030. Illinois passed the most comprehensive climate clean energy and clean energy jobs legislation in its history, and Republican Governor Rauner was hoisting the bill over his head during the signing ceremony. He was a huge champion on the legislation. Michigan, Republican governor, Republican legislature passed renewable energy and energy efficiency mandates last year with overwhelming Republican support in their legislature. And in Ohio, similarly, Governor Kasich was a champion for clean energy because he knew the jobs potential in the state and kept their standards growing. So all of these, once these policies are added up, they're significant in terms of the emission reductions potential. It's like 19 million cars off the road equivalent. But I almost feel like even more importantly is the political example that was created, the political space that was created for all different voices to find their own path forward on clean energy. And we've started this virtual cycle where as the clean energy industries start to expand and grow, they're creating jobs, they're providing health benefits, and this virtuous cycle will continue to spin. So I will close there by saying we know at the federal level things are going to be log-jammed in the best case scenario for a while. But we can make significant progress at the state and local level. And I urge all of us to do what I think happened in the Midwest, which is work with diverse partners, be innovative in how we approach the problem, and focus on solutions that provide economic benefits, health benefits, and make sure that those benefits are distributed equitably and not just accumulated within certain demographics. I really believe that's what's needed to drive the successes at a rate quick enough for us to avoid the worst impacts of global warming. The technology exists today for us to make the switch to 100% clean energy right now. The thing that's holding us back the most is just political and public will and leadership. The good news is that those are renewable resources that we all have inside ourselves, and the more we use them, they're not depleted, they're replenished, and they get stronger and stronger the more we use them. So I hope all of you will join us in flexing those muscles. Thanks.
Can everybody hear me without a microphone? Or should I pick one up? Is this live? This is live. Hi, I'm Ed Warner, and I'm going to continue this kind of example, which was an example of a vast collaboration of various stakeholders. And I have a similar story with a very rocky history to it. So there's good news, there's bad news, and then there's good news. So in 2004, there was a lawsuit. I'm sorry, Wynn, but I'm not really a fan of lawsuits. There was a lawsuit to list the greater sage grouse in the Rocky Mountain West. The greater sage grouse is a ground nesting bird living on the sagebrush steppe. And the habitat, the historical habitat of the greater sage grouse covers 200 million acres of the American West, from northeastern California, a little bit in Washington, across the Rocky Mountains into Saskatchewan, and all the way into Colorado. So a vast amount of territory would have been subject to a very big regulatory change in the way land use was going to be managed if this was listed. 6 months later, a friend of mine who worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in their Washington office called me up, and we went out to coffee in Denver, Colorado. And in 2 hours, we created the framework for what we ended up calling the Cooperative Sagebrush Initiative, which was a voluntary initiative among all the potential stakeholders. Nobody was going to be excluded from participating in this on a voluntary basis to do enough stewardship to recover sage grouse populations to the point where it would never have to be listed. Now, I want you to think about this, because even though these were very, very good people, without the threat of the Endangered Species Act, we probably could not have actually motivated them. There is a vast economic interest that we also should consider, which is actually not part of the ESA and which has become a kind of a sticking point. And so why on earth would a guy from the government come to somebody who is an independent philanthropist and ask him to participate? And as all strange things happen in life, you have accidents of fate, which you can take advantage of if you're lucky. And in this case, I was an oil and gas geologist, independent, with 2 clients who came up with an absolutely crazy, out-of-the-box idea, which nobody in my profession believed. In fact, they knew I was wrong. And so when I presented this crazy idea to 27 different companies in the Rocky Mountains, I got turned down 27 times. And it happened to be a hidden geological feature that nobody anticipated, except, I can't explain why, me. We had to keep the darn thing. We had to keep the 3rd largest gas field in the history of the US because we couldn't even give half of it away to get some of our money back. And so what Carl Hess Jr. was coming to me for was entry into the industrial side of the equation, the energy companies, natural gas, fossil fuels of different kinds, coal, the transmission companies. By an accident of fate, everybody knew who I was, and I could knock on the door of a small or a major energy company and not get turned away. Energy companies had been labeled the enemies of the environment, and they were pretty bitter about this. And so no environmental group, no matter how well-meaning, was going to get in the door. And it worked. We did not exclude anybody. It was the state and federal agencies, it was local working groups, industries of different kind, including transmission companies and utilities. It was the tribes, the private landowners, the various communities that would be impacted by all of this. And we put together this enormous cooperative group to do public-private partnerships and work on private lands to restore sage-grouse habitat so that the sage-grouse would be recovered by private landowners and public-private partnerships. We had to come up with some really radical approaches to how to get this done, because on private lands at that time there was an enormous fear of the Endangered Species Act. Literally, if you went up to a rancher in Wyoming and said, I want to walk on your lands, he would say, do you work for the government? And you might have a 12 gauge actually over the guy's arm. It happened to me. So there was a huge antipathy towards government actions. There was a huge fear factor involved. How on earth are you going to get those guys who have the land to be involved with government agencies that they fear, with oil and gas companies who had never, supposedly at least, given a hoot about the environment? And so what we did was come up with a whole bunch of really, really creative arguments and approaches to things. So if you would ever travel across, say, southwestern Wyoming, where there are private lands and grazing rights allotments, and ranchers control very large landscapes of both government and their own private fee simple lands, you would discover that there are no fences. And so one of the consequences of something like ESA would have been to segregate lands, because only government lands could be managed by government agencies that have to be sequestered. It would actually cause fragmentation, the opposite negative consequence of what you actually wanted. So you wanted to preserve the fact that these lands were unfenced and could be managed as a public-private partnership. And so we had an argument for the ranchers to keep their lands accessible to them and not have this thing happen to them. Then I went to the oil companies and I said, hey guys, a grazing rights allotment rancher knows that if he eats all the darn grass, he will not have places to graze next year. He's already become a grassland ecologist. He doesn't ranch anymore like his grandfather and his great-grandfather. He's a scientific manager of the land already. And he has an ethical responsibility, remember the Sand County Almanac and Aldo Leopold, towards treating that land properly, even though he doesn't actually own it. Just because he's a lessee doesn't mean that he doesn't have a responsibility. So I looked at the oil company executives and said, so do you. So do you. Just because you have an oil and gas lease, you're affecting the surface. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, everybody loves acronyms, you have a responsibility called a mitigation expense when you develop to have an environmental offset. And I said, I want to convince you that we have an ecosystem services model that would work, and we flew them to projects where it was working. And then I took all the environmental groups and I said, I want to show you what an actual big natural gas development looks like, so that you don't think that we ought to be doing conservation there, and flew them all up to western Wyoming, to Jonah and Pinedale Fields, which were industrial sites. Why would you want to have on-site mitigation on a Walmart parking lot? That's nuts. When right over the hillside down there was really critical habitat along the Green River, winter habitat for sage-grouse, summer habitat for sage-grouse. Why not spend mitigation off-site? Totally revolutionary. Why not do ecosystem services payments? And we funded this, and what we did was we did not do Wyoming. It's actually too big. We went to northeastern California, where there's an isolated sage-grouse population, where we could do demonstration projects very much more simply. And we got the largest conservation innovation grant from the Department of Agriculture ever issued, with matching funds from energy companies, the Bradley Fund for the Environment, and other organizations. And we got it all together. They said, Ed, we want you to be the president of the governing board. And I looked around and said, I am never the chairman or the president of anything. I lead directly from behind. And so the Sand County Foundation stepped up, and the president became the governing council. And I want you to go back to the name, Cooperative Sagebrush Initiative, not sage-grouse. This was about biodiversity. This was not about a single species. Now, that's a smokescreen, of course, because the sage grouse was the most critical. But there were pygmy rabbits, and there were all kinds of other obligate species that, for me, were just as important. Biodiversity, more important than recovering one single species, because that's a long-term goal. That's a very bigger landscape vision. And guess what happened to us? In 3 years' time, the federal agencies co-opted everything with a couple of state agencies. They were afraid of two things: that people working in a cooperative would get credit for doing conservation on private lands better than they do, and they would not have control of the money. And we got totally shut down. This concept of off-site mitigation was a tremendous threat to the BLM because they had control of that money. And I knew that there was a problem in their process because in my own great gas discovery, I was in charge of the environmental impact statement, the EIS. And guess what happened? We coughed up $28 million, and they built a $19 million office for themselves in Pinedale, Wyoming. Mitigation of environmental impact? Hello? Excuse me, we wanted to see every penny of it go on the ground, but also go on the ground where it would do the most good. And so we got totally blown out of the water. It was reconfigured into the Sage Grouse Initiative, SI instead of CSI. And it was done with the local working groups that we had identified, with the fish and game agencies that we had identified. All the partnerships actually played out. And while I never get any credit for it, I wanted to give the credit to the people who were doing it anyhow. And so be careful what you ask for. You might actually get it. And 11 years later, that would have been 2.5 years ago, the Secretary of Interior in Denver, Colorado, made the first announcement, which was that the subpopulation in California, northeastern California, had been totally recovered on private lands and would never be listed. And then, as you know, 1 year later, she made the announcement in the same place at the old federal reserve that is now, it used to be a toxic site, and now it's a game preserve in northeast of Colorado, that the sage grouse would never be listed, that the lawsuit was done and it would never be listed. And what she quoted as the success was a combination of federal agencies, public-private partnerships, and conservation on private lands as the key to success. Thank you very much.
I'm batting cleanup here on a Friday afternoon, so I'm going to do my best to keep you guys awake. If I can find my slides, there we go. So, I need to begin with a confession. I believe in science, even though it's not exactly de rigueur on high in this town. High they must be, I think. The kind I'm steeped in is where ecosystem protection meets health. Ironically, though, science has been quite a double-edged sword, allowing amazing quality of life and longevity, new understandings of life and the planet. But modern technologies have also created vexing problems, one of which is that we're all now exposed to an array of man-made, dangerous man-made chemicals in the food we eat, our air and water, the products we use daily, and the built environments that we live, work, learn, and play in. In this country alone, we import or manufacture over 74 million pounds of chemicals and raw materials a day. 80,000 plus chemicals have been registered for use in this country, and yet no more than 1% of those have been tested fully for health effects. Science shows, unfortunately, that these chemicals are detrimental to wildlife and human health, causing cancer and asthma, and increasing risk for other conditions, including metabolic, immune, and neurological impairments. So developmental disabilities and diseases of aging like Parkinson's. Even the tiniest exposures to chemicals that mimic or disrupt our hormones and alter how genes function can basically hijack fetal and early childhood development and literally program us for disease later in life. So trends like these aren't surprising. I'll give you a moment to look at that. This is expensive and sad. A 2008 analysis estimated that environmental contaminant-related problems in the U.S. kids cost $76.6 billion that year, every year. And in 2013, we learned that neurodevelopmental effects of childhood lead exposure, just lead exposure alone, cost $51 billion annually in the United States, despite progress that we've made in lead reduction here. In mid and low-income countries, lead exposure costs almost $1 trillion annually. And that's 7 times the total development aid that we give each year. A soon-to-be released Lancet report, it's a commission that has done this fantastic report you'll see soon on pollution and health, tells us that disease caused by pollution kills 3 times as many people as AIDS, TB, and malaria combined. Some of the chemicals people and wildlife are routinely exposed to can also damage sperm and egg, our very ability to reproduce, which I know all too well. I was raised and later went back to work for 16 years as a tennis coach on the beautiful Hudson River in New York, which had a dirty secret. GE had polluted it. It's well-known history. But also companies adjacent to the tennis courts that I was practiced on and taught on for years were, for decades, actually illegally hiding, burying scads of barrels of PCBs, which are reproductive toxicants and one of the more potent carcinogens known to man. So when later my husband and I experienced unexplained infertility, how could I not wonder if there was a connection, right? But ask health professionals about links between infertility and chemicals, and they're like deer in headlights. Med students just don't get any real training in environmental health. So that's when I knew that somebody had to start demanding answers, and I left my job at Stanford Business School's Social Enterprise Program to become a fellow at an environmental health research institute, where I launched a work group, an international work group of scientists and doctors, policy folks and advocates, and then founded 2 grant-making organizations dedicated to reducing disease burdens by reducing toxic chemical pollution. We support leaders looking for practical and regulatory solutions and fund researchers and organizations who excel at translating science for decision makers in public policy and in medicine. The bottom line is that by reducing environmental contributors to disease, we're working on the far vaster efficiency of upstream disease prevention versus treatment. Now, I'm all for treatment, too. But get this, in our country, 2 to 4 cents at best on the dollar invested in dealing with disease is put toward prevention. That's such an inefficiency, it's got to change. If you just think of preventing 10% of diabetes or cancers, I mean, that's hundreds of billions of dollars a year in cost and suffering in the US alone. The good news is that science and health professionals are starting to catch up. It's encouraging that in the last few years, several large and important professional associations of endocrinologists, pediatricians, OB-GYNs, reproductive health researchers have issued landmark public statements addressing the risks of toxic chemical pollution. And just last week, half of all US practitioners, that's 434,000, signed on to a medical consortium warning about the health effects of climate change, most of which derive from air pollution, so all the same bad chemicals I've been talking about. It's encouraging, too, that more and more consumers understand the quandary posed by toxic ingredients in our everyday products. That awareness has led to increasing demand for safer stuff. Market campaigns today help drive that demand and incite expanded screening of supply chains for chemical hazards. These plus state and federal reform efforts translate into multi-million-dollar demand for safer products and chemicals, and corporations and brands are listening. Some are now finally practicing greater transparency around their ingredients. But even with these points of promise, you know what keeps me up at night? It's a really big-ass unintended consequence. Too often, the bad actor chemicals are simply being replaced by something that's just as untested or just as bad. That's called regrettable substitutions, or whack-a-mole. A good example is baby bottles. So many are now marketed as BPA or bisphenol A free. I know you've heard of that chemical. But the BPA is replaced by a small tweak called BPS, and it's just as bad. So we create false confidence in moms buying those bottles. We may not actually be reducing hazardous exposures. In essence, advocates have been successful at creating these toxics restrictions, but the supply of proven safer alternatives lacks way behind, and like Barry's fish. So how does this happen? First, unlike for pharmaceuticals, there's no FDA for chemicals in the United States. So it's kind of a Wild West crapshoot where health and safety are concerned. And corporations can pollute our ecosystems and your bodies with almost no liability for your cancer or your kid's brain tumor. Second, there is no chemistry degree program in the world that requires a single course in toxicology. So chemists don't invent things with endocrine disruption or health as a lens. I'm going to skip this because I'm going to go over too long, but I will say that recently this too is kind of beginning to shift. China and India have become hubs of green chemistry innovation, and there are now 10 or 12 universities in the United States that have established programs in green chemistry to try to promote a fundamental redesign of the way chemists think and design. And we funded wonderful business NGO partnerships that have developed these comprehensive chemicals test protocols and screens and databases. And I love this. Sorry, wrong one. Guess it's not in there. So they've developed this chemical footprint sort of framework that's comparable to the carbon footprint calculators. It's huge. I'm taking huge back. It's a really huge development. What does this add up to? We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. I believe it's simply not conscionable as a funder to continue the grant funding that we have unless we're also putting significant resources into scaling the innovation and commercialization of actually safer alternatives. So Forsythia did a multi-year sort of exploration of how innovation and commercialization in green chemistry happens. I call that benign by design materials. How money flows to that and what our highest leverage strategy to scale that would be. And we are now a solutions-oriented investor, deploying all of our assets, grants, and the investment corpus in integrated ways to advance the mission. We just instigated the launch of SaferMade, which is a new first-of-its-kind venture fund investing in companies that create products and processes that are safer for people and planet. It's an untapped market niche where if you're smart and strategic with your dollars, you can bridge good ideas into a great commercial and environmental success. The market numbers are really impressive. It's like where organics were about 10 or 15 years ago. SaferMade's managing partners are moving right into this financial and impact return opportunity. They're working with leading brands like Patagonia, Levi's, Nike, Method, and others to commercialize the safer solutions that those guys are desperately seeking. And a good example would be stain and water repellents. with the companies that sell outdoor clothes, so you don't end up with this crap in your water. And Safer Made's reviewed over 150 startups already in technologies and products and processes across things like apparel, textiles, food systems, electronics, and what we call formulated products, so beauty, care, makeup, that sort of thing. And we as anchor investors view Safer Made as the definition of value investment proposition. It's a cutting-edge way to leverage philanthropy in biodiversity, in environment, in health, in early childhood and education, in sustainable food, agriculture, and commerce as well. It's a starting wave, and if it's successful, we'll accelerate the pipeline of safer ways to make the world go round, and we're going to increase our foundation's grant budget, so win-win. And one day, I hope that the crust of this wave will include, and here I want a drum roll from the moderator to talk about optimism. We'll have less ecosystem pollution, reduced healthcare spending, and a lower U.S. deficit. Thank you.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. So we were hoping to have a little bit more than that, but we have 5 minutes. So let's open it up. If you have questions, go ahead and go to a mic. Just line up, and we'll do as much as we can. Thank you.
Hi. My question is for Mr. Gold. First of all, I wanted to thank you for everything that you do for our waterways and oceans. I think it's really hard to overestimate. My question is whether you address government subsidies in fisheries. Thank you.
Yeah, we at the Walton Foundation have not done that directly, but before this I was at the Moore Foundation. We did fund a lot of work around subsidies through the WTO and then moved that into a more bilateral set of issues, but it is a critical issue that we probably need to look at.
I think that one's working, but please, it's fine. Go ahead. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Great presentations. Thank you. I kind of have a general question for all of you. There is often a balance between science and implementation, and I'm just wondering, what is that relationship for funders in general? And I guess more specifically, is there initiatives to collaborate among funders to design implementation projects as research projects?
Thank you.
So I would say for us, science is at the core of everything that we do, but the government actually still has a lot more money than we do to invest in basic research. So we've invested more in sort of synthesis projects where we need them and trying to actually take the knowledge from science and implement it. The collaboration happens, that's a really fascinating question. Funders really require their grantees to collaborate. We're not great models of it ourselves, mostly because if we're strategic philanthropists, we've built a strategic plan, we've gotten alignment with our board, and we're committed to deliver certain outcomes. And then figuring out how to collaborate in that space, we've created some bottlenecks and challenges for ourselves. I was actually on a call just before this meeting for an hour with a bunch of other funders where we were talking just about that issue. Could we collaborate more on the issue of, in this case, scientific integrity, protecting the underlying role of science in evidence-based decision-making and by extension, implementation?
I think this is a really great place because of the composition of our board. I would point out that the larger the organization, the more organized it's going to be. The smaller the organization, the more potentially nimble. And so the Sand County Foundation is 50 years old, but it's always been very small, very collaborative, has always sought partners and always given them credit, which is a hard thing to come by sometimes in our world. And by being science-based, we fail a lot. And that's something that is hard for a lot of other organizations and institutions. In order to accomplish change, you have to be willing to fail. And the good news is, I think Barry's been at these kind of meetings, that the new wave of entrepreneurs, from the Bill Gateses to other various nouveau philanthropy organizations, have taken this entrepreneurial spirit that has created their wealth and translated that to philanthropy. And I think that's a revolution in American philanthropy that's going to bear a lot of fruit, along with a lot of experimentation, which will not succeed, but it will bear a lot of innovation, a lot of fruit in the next couple of decades.
Really quick, I think I understood your question a little bit differently, but so obviously everything we do is deeply scientifically based, and I have a real pet peeve with advocates who overinterpret science. But what I worry about, what I find is that if we go to the Hill and talk to members about environmental health risks and problems and the need to reform U.S. chemicals management, what I find too often is that facts don't matter and science doesn't matter as much as we want it to. But what does matter is health problems. Members tell us, bring me a nurse from Kansas and a kid with cancer. So it's science translating to the health implications that really moves things. And yes, we work almost always by collaborations between all the stakeholders and kind of our activist funders in that sense.
I'd like to add that in the legal area, over the years, we have supported putting scientists and economists on the public interest law firms' staff, because that is an important part of any and all legal work that goes on. It's based on science. It has to be, or economics, one or the other, depending.
I think this is our last question, so please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Claire Fiesler. I'm a young conservation biologist. I'll be getting my doctorate in about a couple months, which I'm very excited about. I've gotten most of my research money in the past 6 years from private organizations because they fund exploratory, highly experimental research projects. And I wanted to know, to what extent are you interested in exploratory, highly experimental conservation projects? Thanks.
I'll go really quickly. We have a $25 to $30 million endowment, so science is way too big for us to fund. Though at the first foundation I funded, we had this really cool program called Science Innovation Fund, and what we were doing was funding preliminary data generation where there were real gaps. You have to have preliminary data to go get the bigger federal grants. And so we had a lot of fun playing in the space of giving 25 and 50K grants to generate the kind of data that would answer questions that were being hotly debated in chemical circles, but also could attract an R01 or some of the other federal bigger grants.
For us, we fund a lot of that work. Well, not a lot relative, but where we see the need, but foundations go through cycles, right? So we put in place, let's say in our Mississippi River work, where we're trying to change farming practices on 100 million acres. We think the strategy is to use cover crops, no-till, build soil health, get resilience. So we funded a lot of that work in the first phase. Now we're in the execution and implementation. So I think it just depends on where you are, but I think all funders try to fill those gaps when they don't have it. I think there is a real gap. I don't know anybody that's out there that has a conservation biology program, just funding in general.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be here if you have further questions.